In the living rooms of America, something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in human history, war was being served alongside dinner. Families gathered around their television sets. Forks paused mid-air as images of combat flickered across their screens. The year was 1965, and the Vietnam War was becoming the first televised war in history. What unfolded over the next decade would fundamentally alter the relationship between media, government, and the American public forever. This is the story of how a small black box in the corner of every home became the most powerful weapon in a war fought thousands of miles away. It's the story of how images, words, and broadcasts didn't just report a war, but shaped its outcome and transformed a nation's consciousness. Welcome to the story of how media changed the Vietnam War and America. To understand the revolutionary nature of Vietnam War coverage, we must first step back into the world that existed before it. We must understand how wars had been reported previously, and why Vietnam represented such a seismic shift in the landscape of journalism and public consciousness. During World War II, war reporting operated under vastly different rules. Journalists were embedded with military units, yes, but they were also subject to strict military censorship. Every photograph, every dispatch, every piece of film footage had to pass through military censors before it could reach the American public. This wasn't seen as controversial or authoritarian. It was accepted as necessary for national security and troop safety. The images that Americans saw of World War II were carefully curated. They showed American heroism, Allied victories, and the clear moral necessity of the fight against fascism. When photographs of American casualties were published, it was done deliberately and with considerable delay, as the government slowly prepared the public for the realities of warfare. The famous photograph of American soldiers raising the flag at Iwo Jima became an iconic symbol, but it represented a sanitized, heroic vision of combat that glossed over the brutal realities soldiers faced daily. The Korean War, which raged from 1950 to 1953, saw somewhat more independent journalism, but it was still constrained by several factors. First, television was in its infancy. While some Americans owned TV sets, penetration was nowhere near what it would become by the mid-60s. Second, the technology for filming and broadcasting from distant battlefields was cumbersome and expensive. Third, there was still a strong cultural memory of World War II unity, a sense that Americans should support their troops without question, and that the media's role was to boost morale rather than critically examine policy. Journalists who covered Korea, like the legendary Marguerite Higgins, produced powerful written dispatches, but these reached relatively small audiences compared to what was coming. The war was often called the Forgotten War, partly because it lacked the dramatic narrative clarity of World War II, and partly because it simply wasn't as visible to the American public. By the early 1960s, however, the media landscape was transforming rapidly. Television ownership had exploded. By 1965, over 90% of American households owned at least one television set. The three major networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had developed sophisticated news divisions with significant resources. Technological advances meant that film footage could be transported from Southeast Asia to American living rooms in a matter of days rather than weeks. Equally important was the cultural moment. The early 60s represented a time of growing questioning of authority, particularly among younger Americans. The civil rights movement had demonstrated that the government could be wrong, that official narratives could conceal injustice, and that peaceful protest could change society. This created an environment where journalists felt emboldened to ask harder questions, and where audiences were more receptive to critical coverage. When the United States began escalating its involvement in Vietnam, the media initially approached the story with the same patriotic assumptions that had characterized earlier war coverage. Early reports from Vietnam in the early 60s portrayed American advisors as heroes helping the South Vietnamese people resist communist aggression. The narrative was simple: the good guys versus the bad guys, democracy versus totalitarianism. But Vietnam was different. The Pentagon, confident in both the righteousness of its cause and its ability to achieve victory, made a fateful decision. They would allow journalists unprecedented access to the battlefield. There would be no formal censorship of war reporting. Journalists could go anywhere, film anything, and report what they saw without military approval. This decision was based on the assumption that when Americans saw their troops in action, they would be proud and supportive. It was an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. When American journalists began arriving in Saigon in larger numbers in the early 60s, they found themselves in a strange, disorienting place. Vietnam was unlike anything they had covered before. It wasn't a conventional war with clear front lines and easily identifiable enemies. It was something more ambiguous, more morally complex, and far more difficult to capture in the simple narratives that audiences expected. The early journalists in Vietnam were a remarkable group. They were young, ambitious, and idealistic. Many of them genuinely believed in the American mission initially, but they were also committed to reporting what they actually saw rather than what they were told to see. Names like David Halberstam of the New York Times, Neil Sheehan of UPI, Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press, and Peter Arnett of the Associated Press would become legendary for their coverage. These journalists quickly discovered that the official narrative being promoted by both the U.S. military and the South Vietnamese government bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. They were told that the South Vietnamese army was winning hearts and minds, yet they witnessed corruption, brutality, and stunning incompetence. They were told that the communist Viet Cong were on the verge of collapse, yet the insurgency seemed to grow stronger by the day. One of the first major stories that revealed the gap between official narrative and reality was the coverage of the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963. This small battle in the Mekong Delta became a symbol of everything that was going wrong in Vietnam. South Vietnamese forces, despite massive advantages in numbers and firepower, and despite being supported by American advisors and helicopters, were defeated by a much smaller Viet Cong force. The American military advisors on the ground were furious and embarrassed, but when they tried to brief reporters, many of the journalists had been there. They had seen what actually happened. David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan wrote scathing accounts that contradicted the official version of events. This created one of the first major conflicts between the press and the military in Vietnam. The response from Washington and from the U.S. military command in Saigon was to try to discredit and marginalize these journalists. President Kennedy himself complained about Halberstam's reporting and even pressured the New York Times to remove him from Vietnam. But the Times stood by their reporter, and the stories kept coming. Then came one of the most iconic images of the early Vietnam conflict. On June 11, 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down in a busy Saigon intersection, assumed the lotus position, and calmly burned himself to death in protest against the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government. Malcolm Brown, who had been tipped off about the protest, was there with his camera. The photograph he took of the burning monk was published around the world and won the Pulitzer Prize. This image was a watershed moment. It revealed that the government America was supporting was not a beacon of democracy, but a repressive regime that had alienated large portions of its own population. More broadly, it demonstrated the power of a single photograph to undermine months of official propaganda. No amount of government press releases could erase what people had seen with their own eyes. The military and political establishment began to realize they had a problem. But rather than address the underlying issues that journalists were reporting on, the initial response was to blame the messenger. Journalists were accused of being too negative, of not understanding the bigger picture, of undermining the war effort. Admiral Harry Felt famously confronted Neil Sheehan after the Battle of Ap Bac, saying, "You're always looking for something bad to report." This tension between journalists seeking truth and officials trying to manage perception would define the media's role throughout the war. The year 1965 marked a dramatic escalation in American involvement in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson, who had inherited the conflict from Kennedy and won election in his own right in 1964, made the decision to commit American ground troops in large numbers and begin sustained bombing of North Vietnam. What had been an advisory mission transformed into a full-scale American war. This escalation coincided with the maturation of television news as a medium. In September 1963, CBS and NBC had expanded their evening newscasts from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. This seemingly small change had enormous implications. It meant there was suddenly much more time to fill, much more space for in-depth reporting from places like Vietnam. The major networks invested heavily in their Vietnam coverage. They opened bureaus in Saigon, hired local crews, and sent their most talented correspondents to cover the story. CBS had Morley Safer. Walter Cronkite would eventually go himself. NBC had the legendary team, including Howard Tuckner and John Chancellor at various points. ABC, though smaller, also committed significant resources. For the first time, war coverage became a central, sustained part of the evening news. What Americans saw on their screens each night was unlike anything previous generations had witnessed. They saw American soldiers wading through rice paddies, they heard the crackle of gunfire, they witnessed the wounded being carried to helicopters. The footage was rarely broadcast live. It still took several days to ship film from Vietnam to New York, but it was close enough to real time to feel immediate and urgent. Some of the most powerful reporting from this period focused not on dramatic battles, but on the daily reality of the war. Morley Safer's August 1965 report from the village of Cam Nay became one of the most controversial broadcasts of the war. Safer's camera crew filmed U.S. Marines using their Zippo lighters to burn down the thatched homes of Vietnamese peasants. The footage showed Marines casually setting fire to homes, while elderly Vietnamese pleaded and cried. Safer's narration was measured, but the images spoke for themselves. This was not the heroic, liberating force that Americans imagined their military to be. This looked like the actions of an occupying army alienating the very people it was supposedly there to help. The broadcast caused fury within the Johnson administration. President Johnson himself called CBS President Frank Stanton, screaming, "Frank, are you trying to fuck me? Your boys just shit on the American flag." But this was just the beginning. As the war intensified and American casualties mounted, the coverage became more visceral and more disturbing. In 1967, CBS correspondent John Lawrence and his cameraman filmed an extended battle at Hill 875 near Dak To. The footage showed dead Americans, wounded soldiers crying out for medics, and the chaos and terror of modern combat. When edited segments aired on the CBS Evening News, Americans at home got an unfiltered look at what war actually meant. The networks walked a careful line. They generally avoided showing the most graphic images. American bodies were rarely shown clearly, and the worst injuries were left on the cutting room floor. But even the sanitized version they broadcast was far more graphic than anything Americans had seen from previous wars. The cumulative effect was powerful. Week after week, month after month, the war came into American homes. Network correspondents in Vietnam developed a complex relationship with the military. Many of the reporters genuinely liked and respected the soldiers they covered. They shared their dangers, ate their food, and saw their courage and sacrifice up close. But they also saw the futility, the strategic confusion, and the gap between what commanders claimed was happening and what was actually occurring in the field. This created a subtle but important shift in how the war was portrayed. Early in the war, coverage tended to frame stories around American objectives. Will we win this battle? Are we making progress? But as reporters spent more time in Vietnam and saw the same ground being fought over repeatedly, as they watched the casualty figures climb while the strategic situation seemed unchanging, the framing began to shift toward more skeptical questions. Is this strategy working? What are we actually accomplishing? Is this war winnable? While television brought the visceral images of war into American homes, print journalists were conducting an equally important and often more analytical examination of the conflict. The major newspapers and magazines had the space and the format to dig deeper, to question policy assumptions, and to provide the context that television's brief segments could not. The New York Times, despite the early controversy over Halberstam's reporting, continued to provide extensive coverage of Vietnam. Reporters like R.W. Apple, who arrived in Saigon in 1965, combined on-the-ground reporting with sophisticated analysis of strategy and policy. Apple's dispatches often highlighted the disconnect between optimistic official assessments and the grim reality in the field. But it was Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times who created perhaps the biggest storm in print journalism during the war. In December 1966, Salisbury became the first American journalist from a major news organization to report from Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. His dispatches, published on the front page of the Times, reported that American bombing raids were hitting civilian areas in North Vietnam, contrary to official U.S. claims that only military targets were being struck. Salisbury described visiting bombed-out residential neighborhoods, hospitals, and schools. He reported civilian casualties and the anger of North Vietnamese citizens. The reaction in Washington was explosive. Administration officials and supporters of the war accused Salisbury of being a dupe of communist propaganda, of parroting enemy claims without verification, of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. The controversy raised profound questions about journalism during wartime. Should American reporters report from enemy territory? Could they believe anything they were shown by a communist government? Was such reporting unpatriotic or even treasonous? Or was it essential journalism, providing Americans with information about what their government was actually doing in their name? The Times stood behind Salisbury, though even some within the newspaper had doubts about aspects of his reporting. The episode illustrated how deeply controversial critical coverage of the war had become. It also demonstrated that the war was being fought not just on battlefields in Vietnam, but in the realm of public opinion at home, and that journalism had become a crucial weapon in that fight. Beyond the daily reporting, longer-form magazine journalism provided even more depth. Publications like The New Yorker, Harper's, and The Atlantic published extended examinations of the war that questioned fundamental assumptions. Writers like Francis Fitzgerald, whose reporting would eventually become the acclaimed book Fire in the Lake, examined the profound cultural misunderstandings that underlay American policy in Vietnam. These articles reached smaller audiences than television or daily newspapers, but they influenced opinion leaders, intellectuals, politicians, and other journalists. They helped create a framework for understanding the war that emphasized its complexity, its ambiguity, and the limitations of American power. They challenged the simple narrative of communist aggression and democratic resistance, instead portraying a more nuanced picture of nationalism, colonialism, and civil war. If there was a single moment when media coverage fundamentally altered the course of the Vietnam War, it was the Tet Offensive of 1968. This massive coordinated attack by communist forces, launched during the Vietnamese New Year celebration, marked the point where the gap between official optimism and actual conditions became undeniable, and where media coverage helped crystallize public opposition to the war. In the months leading up to Tet, the Johnson administration had been engaged in what came to be called the Success Offensive, a coordinated effort to convince the American public that the war was being won. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, made a high-profile visit to the United States in November 1967, during which he declared that the enemy's forces were declining and that he could see light at the end of the tunnel. Television coverage and newspaper reports from late 1967 reflected this cautious optimism, at least in their framing. While individual reporters remained skeptical, the dominant narrative being presented to the American public was that progress was being made, that American strategy was working, and that victory was achievable with continued effort and patience. Then came the early morning hours of January 30th, 1968. Communist forces launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. In Saigon itself, a small commando unit breached the walls of the American embassy compound and fought U.S. guards for 6 hours before being killed. Other attacks struck the presidential palace, Tan Son Nhat Air Base, and South Vietnamese military headquarters. The attack on the embassy was particularly significant because many American journalists were based in Saigon, and they were able to reach the embassy quickly. Cameras captured the surreal scene of American military police fighting off attackers on the embassy grounds. The symbolism was devastating. If the American embassy itself, in the heart of Saigon, could be attacked, what did that say about security anywhere in Vietnam? What did it say about all the claims of progress and enemy weakness? Television networks interrupted regular programming to report on the offensive. Over the following days and weeks, coverage was intense and often dramatic. The cameras captured fierce fighting in the ancient city of Hue, where American and South Vietnamese forces needed weeks to dislodge communist troops who had seized much of the city. They showed the Battle of Khe Sanh, where thousands of Marines were besieged for months at an isolated combat base. One image from the Tet Offensive became especially iconic and controversial. On February 1st, Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams captured the moment when South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executed a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. The photograph showed Loan, in profile, holding a pistol to the head of the prisoner, who wore black pajamas and had his hands tied behind his back. Adams clicked the shutter at the precise instant the gun fired. The photograph won the Pulitzer Prize and became one of the most famous images of the war. It seemed to capture the brutality and moral ambiguity of the conflict. The executed man was reportedly a Viet Cong officer who had just murdered a South Vietnamese officer and his entire family. But that context was not apparent from the photograph. What viewers saw was what appeared to be a summary execution, a violation of the rules of war carried out by an American ally. NBC cameraman Vo Su filmed the same incident, and the footage was broadcast on the Huntley Brinkley Report. American viewers watched a man being shot in the head during dinner time. The film footage was even more shocking than the still photograph because you could see the prisoner crumple to the ground after the shot, blood streaming from his head. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was ultimately a defeat for communist forces. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked. They suffered catastrophic casualties, and the hoped-for popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government never materialized. American and South Vietnamese forces recovered from the initial shock and drove the attackers back with heavy losses. But militarily winning and politically winning are not the same thing. The media coverage of Tet had dealt a devastating blow to public confidence in the war. All the official assurances of progress now seemed like lies or delusions. If the enemy was so weak and defeated, how could they launch such a massive, coordinated offensive? The most famous moment in television news history occurred on February 27, 1968, when Walter Cronkite, anchor of the CBS Evening News and one of the most trusted men in America, offered an extraordinary editorial assessment of the war after returning from a personal visit to Vietnam. Cronkite, who had generally supported the war, concluded his special report by saying that the war was mired in stalemate and that the only rational way out would be negotiation and compromise, not military victory. For it seems now more certain than ever, Cronkite intoned in his authoritative voice, that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. President Johnson, watching from the White House, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." A month later, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, citing the divisions over Vietnam. The media coverage of Tet had not just reported the news, it had fundamentally altered the political landscape. After the Tet Offensive, media coverage of the Vietnam War intensified and became increasingly critical. The dam of official credibility had broken, and journalists felt less constrained in questioning both the strategy and the fundamental justification for the war. The period from 1968 through 1970 saw some of the most powerful and disturbing war reporting in American history. The My Lai massacre, though it occurred in March 1968, didn't become public until November 1969, when journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. His dispatches revealed that American soldiers had systematically murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people, in the village of My Lai. The soldiers had been under orders from Lieutenant William Calley, and the massacre had been covered up by the military for over a year. When Army photographer Ronald Haberle's color photographs of the massacre were published in Life magazine, Americans were confronted with imagery that shattered any remaining illusions about the war. The photographs showed piles of bodies in a ditch, terrified villagers moments before being shot, the blank faces of American soldiers surrounded by their victims. This wasn't the fog of war or tragic collateral damage. This was a war crime, methodically documented. The My Lai story raised profound questions about the nature of the war and what it was doing to American soldiers. How could ordinary young men from places like Ohio and California commit such atrocities? What did this say about American conduct in Vietnam more broadly? Was My Lai an aberration or a symptom of a deeper moral corruption in the war itself? The coverage of My Lai was a defining moment in investigative journalism. Hirsch had pursued the story despite the military's attempts to bury it, despite the reluctance of many news organizations to believe such accusations, and despite the personal risks involved in accusing American soldiers of war crimes. His reporting demonstrated that journalism could still uncover truths that powerful institutions wanted to hide. Television coverage during this period also became more graphic and more critical. Networks showed footage of American soldiers setting fire to villages with Zippo lighters, of wounded children crying in the aftermath of bombings, of the chaos and suffering the war was causing for Vietnamese civilians. The cumulative impact of this coverage, night after night, was to make many Americans question whether the war was morally justifiable, regardless of strategic considerations. The anti-war movement, which had been growing since the mid-60s, was both covered by and amplified by media attention. Major protests, particularly after the U.S. invasion of Cambodia in 1970, and the Kent State shootings, where National Guard soldiers killed 4 student protesters, received extensive coverage. Television brought images of young Americans in the streets, chanting against the war, clashing with police, expressing fury at their government's policies. This coverage of domestic dissent was itself controversial. Administration officials and war supporters argued that the media was giving disproportionate attention to protesters and thereby amplifying their influence. They claimed that the silent majority of Americans still supported the war, but were being drowned out by media coverage of a vocal minority. President Nixon made attacking the media a key part of his political strategy, with Vice President Spiro Agnew delivering fiery speeches condemning what he called nattering nabobs of negativism in the press. The tension between the Nixon administration and the press reached new heights. The administration attempted to subpoena reporters' notes and sources, arguing that national security required limits on press freedom. When the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers in 1971, a classified study of American decision-making in Vietnam that revealed decades of government deception, the administration sought a court injunction to stop publication. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the Times, affirming that press freedom extended even to publishing classified information of historic importance. By the early 1970s, as American combat forces were gradually withdrawn from Vietnam under Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, media attention began to shift somewhat. There were fewer American troops to cover, and the networks reduced their presence in Vietnam. But the war continued for the Vietnamese, and journalists like Gloria Emerson continued to report on the suffering of the Vietnamese people and the ongoing devastation. The final dramatic images of the war came in April 1975, when North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, ending the war in communist victory. Television cameras captured the chaotic evacuation of the American embassy, with helicopters lifting people from the rooftop, while desperate Vietnamese who had allied with America tried to get aboard. These images of defeat and abandonment became the war's final iconic moments, broadcast around the world. While television and written journalism received the most attention, still photography played a crucial and distinctive role in shaping how Americans understood the Vietnam War. Certain photographs became so iconic that they transcended their immediate journalistic purpose and became symbols that defined the war in collective memory. Beyond the images we've already discussed, the burning monk, Eddie Adams' execution photo, and the My Lai massacre, there were others that left indelible marks on public consciousness. One of the most powerful was Nick Ut's photograph from June 8, 1972, showing 9-year-old Phan Thai Kim Phuc running naked down a road, her arms outstretched, her mouth open in a scream, fleeing a napalm attack. Other children run beside her, and in the background, South Vietnamese soldiers walk calmly, seemingly indifferent to the children's agony. This photograph, which won the Pulitzer Prize, seemed to capture everything horrifying about modern warfare's impact on civilians. The girl's nakedness made her vulnerability absolute. Her expression showed pain and terror beyond what any child should experience. The casual demeanor of the soldiers suggested how routine such suffering had become. And the fact that the napalm had been dropped by South Vietnamese aircraft, America's allies, complicated any simple narrative about who the good guys were. When the photograph was transmitted to the AP office in New York, editors initially hesitated to publish it because the girl was naked. But the clear newsworthiness and powerful anti-war message of the image overrode concerns about showing a child's nudity. The photograph was published widely and became one of the most famous images of the war. It made the suffering of Vietnamese civilians impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Combat photographers like Larry Burroughs, who worked for Life magazine, produced work of extraordinary artistic quality while documenting the war's brutality. Burroughs spent 9 years covering Vietnam before being killed in 1971 when his helicopter was shot down over Laos. His color photographs brought a new dimension to war photography. Previous wars had been documented primarily in black and white, but Burroughs' color images made the blood redder, the wounds more visceral, the landscapes more real. His photo essay, One Ride with Yankee Papa 13, which followed a helicopter crew during a mission, showed the war with an intimacy and emotional depth that text alone could never achieve. Images of a wounded door gunner being comforted by his crewmate, of the helicopter crew chief weeping after a fallen comrade's body was removed from the aircraft. These photographs captured the human cost of war in ways that transcended politics or strategy. What made Vietnam War photography particularly powerful was that it was relatively uncensored. Unlike World War II, when military censors controlled what could be published, Vietnam photographers could shoot what they saw and transmit it without official approval. This meant that the full reality of war, in all its gore and tragedy, could reach the public in near real time. The photographers themselves paid a heavy price for this access. Vietnam was the most dangerous war ever covered by journalists. 66 journalists, both American and foreign, were killed covering the conflict in Vietnam and neighboring countries. Many more were wounded. They shared the dangers of combat without the training or equipment that soldiers received. These photographers didn't see themselves as anti-war activists. Most were professional journalists trying to document an important story. But the images they captured, by their very nature, tended to undermine support for the war. It's nearly impossible to make war look good when you show it honestly. The blood, the fear, the wounds, the grief, these realities of combat, when shown without sanitization, tend to make people question whether any objective is worth such suffering. The Vietnam War fundamentally transformed the relationship between the American press and the government. Before Vietnam, there had been an implicit understanding that the press would generally support national security efforts, particularly during wartime. Journalists might criticize tactics or raise questions about efficiency, but they rarely challenged the fundamental legitimacy of American military actions, or suggested that their own government was systematically deceiving the public. Vietnam shattered this consensus. As the war progressed and the gap between official statements and actual conditions became undeniable, journalists became increasingly skeptical of government claims across the board. This skepticism didn't end with Vietnam, it became a permanent feature of American journalism. This transformation didn't happen smoothly or all at once. Throughout the war, there were fierce debates within newsrooms about how critical coverage should be. Many editors and publishers, particularly early in the war, tried to maintain a more traditional, supportive stance toward U.S. policy. They worried that overly critical coverage would undermine troop morale, give comfort to the enemy, or be perceived as unpatriotic. But reporters in the field, who saw the reality up close, pushed back against these concerns. They argued that their obligation was to report the truth, not to support policy. They contended that if the truth was uncomfortable for policymakers, the problem was the policy, not the reporting. This tension between publishers and reporters, between editorial boards and correspondents in the field, played out repeatedly throughout the war. The credibility gap, a term that became common during the Vietnam era, referred to the growing public perception that the government was not telling the truth about the war. Media coverage didn't create this gap, official deception did. But media coverage made the gap visible and measurable. When reporters showed that official body counts were inflated, that pacification programs weren't working, that corruption was endemic in the South Vietnamese government, they weren't undermining America, they were revealing that America was being undermined by its own leaders' dishonesty. This adversarial relationship extended beyond Vietnam to domestic issues as well. The Watergate scandal, which ultimately brought down President Nixon, was in many ways a product of the investigative culture that Vietnam had fostered. Reporters like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein pursued the Watergate story with a tenacity and skepticism toward official denials that was directly descended from Vietnam-era journalism. The military establishment drew very different lessons from Vietnam than the press did. Many military officers believed that media coverage, particularly television coverage, had undermined public support for a war that could have been won militarily if political will had been maintained. They argued that showing casualties in difficult moments without showing the broader strategic picture had given Americans a distorted view of the war. This belief led to significant changes in how the military handled media relations in subsequent conflicts. In Grenada in 1983, the military largely excluded the press from covering the invasion. In Panama in 1989, media access was again restricted. During the 1991 Gulf War, the Pentagon instituted a pool system where only select reporters were allowed to cover combat operations, and they were accompanied by military escorts at all times. The tension between press freedom and military operational security, between the public's right to know and the military's need for surprise and secrecy, remains unresolved to this day. But there's no question that Vietnam marked the end of an era of cooperative, supportive war reporting and the beginning of a more suspicious, questioning approach. The media coverage of Vietnam didn't just affect opinions about the war, it transformed American society in profound and lasting ways. The war, as seen on television and in newspapers, became a central reference point for debates about American power, morality, and identity that continue to this day. For many Americans, particularly those who came of age during the war years, the images from Vietnam created a deep distrust of government and authority that never fully healed. The realization that their government had systematically deceived them, that thousands of young Americans had died in a war based on false pretenses and flawed strategy, created a cynicism that extended far beyond foreign policy. This generational divide was itself amplified by media coverage. Older Americans, who remembered World War II and who had been raised to trust government and support the military, often couldn't understand the younger generation's opposition to the war. They saw the protesters on television and viewed them as ungrateful, disloyal, even treasonous. Younger Americans, who saw the war's futility and immorality in the images coming from Vietnam, couldn't understand how their elders could continue supporting such a disaster. Television coverage of the war brought the protest movement into every home, making it a constant presence in American life. The chants of, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The images of young people burning draft cards and American flags, the violent confrontations between police and protesters at the 1968 Democratic Convention, these became part of the nation's collective experience in a way that previous protests never had. The counterculture movement of the 1960s was intimately tied to opposition to the Vietnam War, and media coverage linked them inseparably. Long hair, rock music, drug use, sexual freedom, rejection of traditional values. These cultural changes became associated in many Americans' minds with anti-war sentiment, even though the connections were often more complex than the media coverage suggested. For veterans returning from Vietnam, the media coverage created a difficult and often painful reality. Unlike soldiers returning from World War II, who were greeted as heroes, Vietnam veterans came home to a deeply divided country. Some were blamed for a war they hadn't chosen to fight, viewed with suspicion or contempt because of images like My Lai. Others were simply ignored, their sacrifice unacknowledged because the nation wanted to forget the war. The stereotype of the troubled, psychologically damaged Vietnam veteran became a fixture of American culture, reinforced by films like The Deer Hunter, Coming Home, and later Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. While these portrayals had some basis in reality, the focus on trauma and dysfunction sometimes obscured the fact that most Vietnam veterans successfully reintegrated into civilian life. But the image persisted, shaped partly by how the war had been covered and remembered. For the Vietnamese people, both in Vietnam and in the diaspora that fled after the communist victory, the American media coverage was a source of mixed feelings. On one hand, journalists who reported on civilian casualties and the suffering of ordinary Vietnamese were telling stories that needed to be told. On the other hand, the coverage was intensely focused on the American experience of the war, with Vietnamese perspectives often relegated to the background. The Vietnamese were present in the images, but not often given voice to tell their own stories. More than 50 years after the fall of Saigon, debates about media coverage of the Vietnam War remain contentious. These arguments aren't merely historical. They continue to shape how Americans think about the press, the military, and the proper relationship between them. One enduring debate centers on whether the media lost the war. Conservative critics, including many military officers, have long argued that negative media coverage, particularly after the Tet Offensive, turned American public opinion against a war that was being won militarily. They contend that the media focused disproportionately on American failures and casualties while ignoring successes and progress. By this logic, the press snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by undermining the political will necessary to continue the fight. This argument gained particular traction in military circles and became almost an article of faith among those who believed the war could have been won with more time and resources. They pointed to the fact that the Tet Offensive was ultimately a military defeat for communist forces, yet media coverage portrayed it as an American failure. They argued that showing casualties without context, focusing on dramatic moments of combat rather than the slow work of pacification and nation-building, created a distorted picture that made victory seem impossible. However, this interpretation has been challenged by journalists, historians, and many military analysts. They argue that the media didn't lose the war. Flawed strategy, impossible objectives, and systematic governmental deception lost the war. The press simply reported what was actually happening, and what was happening was that American strategy wasn't working. No amount of positive coverage could have changed the fact that the United States was trying to build a viable South Vietnamese state in a country where nationalism and communism had become inseparable for many people, where corruption was endemic, and where the enemy was willing to accept casualties that would be politically unsustainable in America. Moreover, defenders of the media point out that much of the coverage, particularly in the early and middle years of the war, was actually quite supportive of American troops and objectives. It was the accumulation of evidence over time, the repeated pattern of official optimism being contradicted by events that made coverage more critical. If the government had been honest about the challenges from the beginning, if strategy had been coherent and effective, the coverage would have been very different. Another enduring controversy involves the question of media bias. Critics accused Vietnam War reporters of being anti-war activists disguised as journalists, of selectively reporting information that fit their political agenda. They pointed to the fact that many prominent journalists who covered Vietnam, like David Halberstam, Harrison Salisbury, and Seymour Hersh, were known for liberal political views. But this accusation oversimplifies a complex reality. Most journalists who covered Vietnam didn't start out opposing the war. Many initially believed in the American mission and wanted to see it succeed. What changed their perspective was what they witnessed in the field, the gap between rhetoric and reality, between what they were told at official briefings and what they saw with their own eyes in villages and battlefields. Furthermore, being critical of how the war was being conducted didn't necessarily mean opposing the war itself. Many reporters who wrote skeptical or negative stories still believed that containing communism was important and that America had legitimate interests in Southeast Asia. They simply didn't believe that the current strategy was working or that the current leaders were being honest. The question of whether graphic images should have been broadcast remains contentious. Some argue that showing the reality of war, however disturbing, was essential for an informed democracy. If Americans were going to support sending young men to fight and die, they needed to understand what that actually meant. Sanitized, heroic coverage would have been a form of propaganda that denied citizens the information they needed to make informed judgments about policy. Others contend that the constant stream of violent, disturbing images had a corrosive effect on public morale, and that there's a difference between informing the public and overwhelming them with horror. They argue that context matters, that showing casualties without explaining the strategic purposes they served made the war seem pointlessly brutal rather than difficult, but necessary. This debate has particular resonance because it continues in contemporary conflicts. Should news organizations show images of American casualties? Should they broadcast footage of civilians killed in airstrikes? How do we balance the public's need to understand the reality of war with concerns about respecting the dead, protecting families from graphic images of their loved ones, and avoiding images that might be used for enemy propaganda? The accusation that anti-war protesters were emboldened and amplified by media coverage is another charge that persists. Critics argue that by giving extensive coverage to protests, particularly dramatic or confrontational ones, the media made the anti-war movement seem larger and more mainstream than it actually was. They contend that this created a feedback loop where coverage encouraged more protests, which generated more coverage, creating a spiral that magnified dissent beyond its actual prevalence. There's some truth to this observation, but it cuts both ways. Media coverage also gave extensive attention to pro-war voices, to politicians defending the war effort, to military spokesmen presenting optimistic assessments. The question is whether the coverage was proportionate to the actual distribution of opinion in the country. As the war continued and casualties mounted without decisive victory, polls consistently showed growing public opposition. The media was reflecting this shift, not creating it. The Vietnam War revolutionized not just the relationship between media and government, but the technologies and institutions of journalism itself. The innovations developed to cover Vietnam continue to shape how news is gathered and presented today. The lightweight portable film cameras that became standard in Vietnam were a significant technological advance. Earlier cameras had been bulky and difficult to transport in combat conditions. The new equipment allowed cameramen to accompany troops on patrol, to film in jungles and rice paddies, to capture combat as it unfolded rather than staging footage after the fact. This portability and flexibility became the standard for television news gathering. The development of satellite technology, though it came too late to fully transform Vietnam coverage, was accelerated partly by the needs of international news gathering. The ability to transmit footage instantly from anywhere in the world, which would become routine by the 1990s, had its roots in the challenges of getting film from Southeast Asia to New York quickly enough to be timely. The network news divisions that covered Vietnam became powerful institutions within their respective companies. Correspondents who made their names in Vietnam, people like Morley Safer, Peter Arnett, and Bernard Kolb, became influential figures who shaped television journalism for decades. The Vietnam War established foreign correspondence, particularly war correspondence, as a prestigious specialty within journalism. The major newspapers similarly built up their foreign reporting capabilities in response to Vietnam. The competition to provide the most comprehensive, insightful coverage drove news organizations to invest in overseas bureaus, to hire language specialists and regional experts, and to support long-term investigative reporting. This infrastructure, once built, continued to serve journalism even after Vietnam ended. The war also accelerated the development of photojournalism as a distinct craft. The intense, dangerous work of photographers in Vietnam elevated the status of the profession. Photo essays in magazines like Life became major cultural events. The Vietnam photographers' combination of artistic vision and journalistic integrity set new standards for the field. Editorially, Vietnam established new norms about what could be shown and discussed in mainstream media. Before Vietnam, there were strong taboos about showing American dead, about discussing the psychological impact of combat, about questioning whether American military actions were morally justified. Vietnam broke down these barriers. While debates continue about where exactly the lines should be, the pre-Vietnam censorious approach to war coverage never returned. The war also transformed journalism education. Schools of journalism began teaching more critical approaches to covering government and institutions. The ideal of the journalist as neutral observer, giving equal weight to official sources, began giving way to a more investigative model, where journalists were expected to verify claims, seek out contrary evidence, and hold power accountable. The phrase, "comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable," became a guiding principle. This shift wasn't without costs. The adversarial relationship between press and government that emerged from Vietnam has sometimes devolved into reflexive cynicism or false equivalence, where journalists feel obligated to treat all claims with equal skepticism, even when evidence clearly supports one side. The erosion of trust in institutions that began with Vietnam has continued, with consequences that extend far beyond journalism. Each American military conflict since Vietnam has been shaped in part by lessons learned or believed to have been learned from Vietnam's media coverage. The military sought to avoid what it saw as Vietnam's mistakes, while journalists fought to maintain the access and independence they had in Vietnam. The Gulf War of 1991 represented the first major test of post-Vietnam media-military relations. The Pentagon imposed strict controls on media access through the pool system, where only designated reporters could cover combat operations, and they were accompanied by military escorts who could control what they saw and filmed. Military briefings featured General Norman Schwarzkopf presenting sanitized video game-like footage of precision strikes hitting targets with minimal collateral damage. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, even celebratory. There were no images of American casualties, very limited coverage of Iraqi casualties, and the war was presented as a technological triumph, a clean, efficient application of American military power. Critics argued this was closer to propaganda than journalism, that the public wasn't seeing the reality of war. Supporters contended that operational security necessitated these restrictions, and that the war's quick, decisive victory vindicated the approach. The Afghanistan and Iraq wars, beginning in 2001 and 2003 respectively, saw a different approach. The military instituted an embedding program where journalists lived with military units, sharing their dangers and daily lives. This created extraordinary access and produced some powerful, intimate reporting. But it also created potential conflicts of interest, as reporters who lived with troops, who depended on them for safety and access, might find it difficult to report critically on their conduct. The embedding system produced mixed results. Some embedded journalists did excellent, balanced work, reporting both the courage and professionalism of American troops and the difficulties and failures of strategy. Others produced coverage that was so sympathetic to the military perspective that it functioned as recruitment propaganda. The variability highlighted how much individual judgment matters in journalism. These later conflicts also unfolded in a transformed media environment. Cable news networks provided 24-hour coverage, which meant more space to fill, but also more pressure to be dramatic and attention-grabbing. The internet allowed for independent journalists, bloggers, and citizen reporters to provide coverage outside traditional media structures. By the time of the Iraq War, digital photography and video meant that graphic images could spread virally, regardless of editorial decisions by mainstream media. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan also lasted longer than Vietnam, though with far fewer American casualties due to improved medical care and different combat patterns. This long duration with relatively low visibility, what some called the Forever Wars, meant that media coverage became sporadic and inconsistent. Unlike Vietnam, where the war was front-page news for years, these conflicts faded from public consciousness even as they continued, only surging back to attention during dramatic moments. The Abu Ghraib scandal in 2004, when photographs of American soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners were leaked, echoed the My Lai revelations from Vietnam. The images shocked the American public and damaged America's moral standing in the world. But the media landscape had changed dramatically. The photographs spread first on the internet, then to traditional media. The military's ability to control the narrative or suppress embarrassing information had diminished significantly. In some ways, these later conflicts vindicated both sides of the Vietnam debate. Military officials could point to the embedded system and more controlled media access as allowing more successful military operations with maintained public support. Journalists could point to cases like Abu Ghraib, the revelation of flawed intelligence about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and critical reporting about counterinsurgency failures as evidence that aggressive journalism remains essential. How a nation remembers a war is shaped profoundly by how that war was covered and portrayed while it was happening. The Vietnam War's media coverage didn't just influence events in real time, it created the raw material for collective memory that continues to shape American identity. The visual iconography of Vietnam, the images that remain seared in cultural memory, almost all came from journalism. The burning monk, the execution on the Saigon street, the naked girl fleeing napalm, the helicopters evacuating the embassy roof, these images didn't just document events, they became the war in American memory. When people think about Vietnam, even those born long after it ended, these are the images that come to mind. This visual memory has had profound effects on how Americans think about war generally. Vietnam established a template of what war looks like: confused, morally ambiguous, characterized by suffering civilians and traumatized soldiers rather than clear victories and heroic triumphs. Every subsequent conflict gets compared to this template. Political debates about military intervention almost always include someone warning about another Vietnam, by which they mean a quagmire without clear objectives or exit strategy. The phrase, "the living room war," became shorthand for how television changed the nature of warfare itself. The idea that seeing war on television creates anti-war sentiment became conventional wisdom, though the actual relationship is more complex. Television coverage of World War II or the early stages of Afghanistan generated patriotic support, not opposition. What mattered wasn't just that war was on television, but what kind of war it was and how honestly it was being portrayed. Hollywood's treatment of Vietnam, which began in earnest in the late 1970s and continued through the 1980s and beyond, was deeply influenced by the war's journalism. Films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and Born on the 4th of July presented Vietnam as a nightmare, a descent into madness and moral corruption. These films drew on the imagery and themes established by war coverage: the senselessness, the brutality, the disconnect between official rhetoric and ground truth. These cinematic representations, in turn, shaped how younger generations understood the war. For people too young to remember the actual coverage, movies became their primary reference point. This created a feedback loop, where journalism informed cinema, which then informed collective memory, which then influenced how new journalism about war was framed and understood. The memorial culture around Vietnam was also shaped by media coverage. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, with its black granite walls listing every American who died in the war, represented a very different kind of memorial than the triumphalist monuments to earlier wars. It was somber, reflective, focused on individual loss rather than collective triumph. This aesthetic choice reflected the nation's ambivalence about the war, an ambivalence created partly by the coverage that brought the war's reality home. For the Vietnamese, both in Vietnam and in the diaspora, American media coverage created a complicated legacy. On one hand, journalists who reported on civilian casualties and questioned the war helped humanize the Vietnamese in American eyes. On the other hand, the coverage was fundamentally about the American experience, with Vietnamese people often reduced to extras in America's national drama. The suffering of Vietnamese civilians was reported, but rarely were Vietnamese given agency or voice in how their story was told. This pattern of war coverage, where the focus is on American experiences and perspectives with local populations relegated to the background, has continued in subsequent conflicts. It reflects both practical limitations. Journalists covering war for American audiences naturally focus on American angles, and deeper assumptions about whose stories matter and whose experiences deserve sustained attention. One of the most significant and troubling legacies of Vietnam War coverage is the contribution it made to the polarization of American media and the fragmentation of shared narrative about national events. The emergence of the credibility gap didn't just affect trust in government, it began a process of fragmenting trust in media itself. During the Vietnam era, despite fierce debates about coverage, Americans still largely consumed news from the same sources. The three major networks and a handful of major newspapers dominated the information landscape. People might disagree about whether the coverage was fair, but they were at least responding to the same reporting, the same images, the same facts, even if they interpreted them differently. The breakdown of this shared information environment began during Vietnam and accelerated in subsequent decades. Conservative critics of Vietnam coverage felt that mainstream media had been biased against the war effort and against traditional American values. This grievance became a foundation for the creation of alternative conservative media, a process that would culminate decades later in Fox News, conservative talk radio, and right-wing internet media. The argument that mainstream media had betrayed America in Vietnam became a powerful mobilizing narrative for conservative politics. Phrases like liberal media bias and the mainstream media, used dismissively, had their roots in the Vietnam-era conflicts over war coverage. The idea that you couldn't trust traditional news sources because they were politically biased against conservative values became an article of faith on the right. This fragmentation has accelerated dramatically with the internet and social media, creating an environment where different segments of the American public live in essentially different informational universes. But the seeds were planted during Vietnam, when a significant portion of the country concluded that the institutions reporting the news couldn't be trusted. Ironically, while conservatives attacked the media for being too critical of the war, many on the left criticized the same coverage for not being critical enough soon enough, for amplifying government propaganda in the early years, for focusing too much on American rather than Vietnamese suffering, for treating anti-war protesters with suspicion and condescension. Both sides found reasons to distrust mainstream journalism, though for opposite reasons. This dual critique put journalism in an impossible position. Any coverage, no matter how careful or balanced, would be attacked by one side or the other as biased. This dynamic has only intensified over time, with journalists increasingly unable to provide coverage that satisfies both partisan camps, leading many to abandon the attempt at balance in favor of explicitly partisan journalism that caters to one audience or the other. The Vietnam experience also contributed to a transformation in journalistic culture itself. Before Vietnam, many journalists saw themselves as part of the establishment, trusted insiders who had a responsibility to support national institutions, even while occasionally critiquing them. After Vietnam, a more adversarial self-conception took hold, where journalists saw themselves as watchdogs, outsiders whose job was to challenge power rather than accommodate it. This transformation had positive and negative consequences. Positively, it made journalism more independent and more willing to investigate wrongdoing by powerful institutions. The Watergate investigation, the Pentagon Papers, exposure of CIA abuses, all reflected this more aggressive approach. Negatively, it sometimes led to reflexive cynicism, a tendency to assume the worst about government motives, and a confrontational style that could generate more heat than light. The question of whether journalists should be advocates or neutral observers, which had been largely settled before Vietnam in favor of neutrality, became unsettled. Reporters who covered Vietnam and saw horrific things happening found it difficult to maintain emotional detachment. Was it really neutral to report that a village had been destroyed without conveying that this was morally wrong? Should journalists really give equal weight to official claims they knew from experience were false? These questions don't have easy answers, and the journalism profession continues to struggle with them. But Vietnam marked the point when they became unavoidable, when the tensions between objectivity and moral witness, between access and independence, between neutrality and truth-telling, became central to journalistic identity. As we reflect on how media changed the Vietnam War and America, it's worth considering what lessons were learned from this tumultuous period and which lessons were ignored or forgotten. One clear lesson is that sustained public support for war requires sustained government honesty. The Johnson and Nixon administration's pattern of deception, of inflating progress and minimizing setbacks, ultimately destroyed their credibility. When the media revealed the gaps between official claims and actual conditions, public trust collapsed. Subsequent administrations have struggled with this lesson, often learning it imperfectly. The George W. Bush administration's claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which proved to be false, echoed the credibility problems of Vietnam. The pattern of official optimism about progress in Afghanistan, consistently contradicted by ground realities, repeated familiar dynamics. The lesson that honesty, even about difficulties and setbacks, is essential for maintaining public trust, seems to need relearning by each generation of leaders. For the military, one lesson taken from Vietnam was the importance of information control. The embedded system in later wars, the careful management of images and access, the use of precision strike footage to create impressions of clean, surgical warfare, all reflected a determination not to let media coverage undermine public support as it had in Vietnam. Whether this represents a healthy recognition of political realities or a problematic restriction on press freedom remains debated. The all-volunteer military, instituted in 1973, partly in response to Vietnam's unpopularity, has had profound effects on the media coverage of the subsequent wars. Without a draft, wars touch far fewer American families directly. This makes sustained media coverage harder to justify economically. Audiences are smaller. and makes it easier for wars to continue with less public attention. The draft made Vietnam everybody's war. The volunteer military makes later conflicts more abstract for most Americans. For journalism, Vietnam should have taught the importance of skepticism toward official claims combined with fairness in evaluation. The best Vietnam reporting was neither blindly patriotic nor reflexively anti-American. It tried to report accurately what was actually happening and let readers or viewers draw their own conclusions. But this balance is difficult to maintain, requiring both access to information and independence from sources. One frequently ignored lesson is the importance of understanding the societies where wars are fought. Much of the failure in Vietnam stemmed from profound American ignorance about Vietnamese history, culture, and politics. The United States tried to fight a war in a country it didn't understand, supporting leaders who lacked popular legitimacy, pursuing strategies that alienated the population they claimed to be defending. Journalists who took the time to learn about Vietnam, to talk with Vietnamese people beyond official sources, to understand the historical context, produced far better coverage than those who simply reported American activities. This lesson has been imperfectly learned. American journalists covering Afghanistan and Iraq often struggled with similar challenges: language barriers, cultural unfamiliarity, over-reliance on American or official sources, the tendency to report wars primarily from the American perspective, treating local populations as background rather than central actors, continues. Another lesson concerns the power and limitations of images. The iconic photographs from Vietnam demonstrated that single images can crystallize public opinion and shift political dynamics. But images without context can also mislead. The execution photograph made General Loan appear as a war criminal, even though the man he killed had just murdered a South Vietnamese officer and his family. The images are true, but incomplete. In today's environment of manipulated images, deep fakes, and viral misinformation, the lessons about visual media's power and limitations are more relevant than ever. Images still have extraordinary power to move people, but trust in images has eroded as people recognize how easily they can be manipulated or decontextualized. Perhaps the most important lesson, frequently ignored, is that media coverage doesn't exist in isolation from reality. Vietnam coverage became increasingly critical, not because journalists were biased, but because the war was going badly and the government was lying about it. No amount of positive spin could have hidden indefinitely that American strategy wasn't working. The lesson for governments should be that media management is no substitute for sound policy. Yet, leaders continue to believe that if they can just control the message, if they can just prevent negative coverage, they can maintain support for failing policies. This confuses cause and effect. Media coverage didn't make Vietnam unwinnable, it revealed that it was unwinnable. The solution wasn't better propaganda, it was better policy or honest acknowledgement that the objectives couldn't be achieved. Although the Vietnam War ended in 1975, its media legacy continues to evolve in the digital age. The war has been re-examined, re-remembered, and reinterpreted through new media technologies that didn't exist when the war was fought. Documentaries using archival footage have allowed new generations to experience the war's coverage in different contexts. Ken Burns' 2017 documentary series, The Vietnam War, used the extensive film and photographic record to create a comprehensive narrative that reached millions of viewers. Such documentaries can include Vietnamese perspectives in ways that contemporary coverage often didn't, offering more nuanced understanding. The internet has made the vast archive of Vietnam War journalism accessible in new ways. Photographs that appeared once in newspapers or magazines can now be viewed and shared instantly. Clips from network news broadcasts that were seen once and then stored in archives are now on YouTube. This accessibility allows for continued examination and reinterpretation of the coverage. Social media has created new platforms for veterans, both American and Vietnamese, to share their stories directly without journalistic intermediaries. Vietnamese voices, which were often marginalized in American media coverage during the war, can now reach global audiences. This has complicated and enriched the historical record, adding perspectives that contemporary journalism missed or ignored. Digital analysis of coverage has allowed researchers to examine patterns quantitatively. Studies have analyzed how often certain words appeared in coverage, how the framing of stories changed over time, and how different news organizations covered the same events differently. This has allowed for a more sophisticated understanding of how coverage evolved and what influenced it. The debates about Vietnam War coverage continue in online forums, blogs, and social media, often reflecting current political divisions. Conservative websites and commentators continue to argue that media bias lost the war. Liberal sites defend the coverage as essential truth-telling. These debates, conducted in comment sections and Twitter threads, show how Vietnam remains a contested space in American memory. Interestingly, the availability of full coverage has allowed people to revisit claims made about the coverage. The argument that television coverage was overwhelmingly negative, for instance, has been challenged by scholars who actually reviewed hundreds of hours of broadcasts and found more nuance, more pro-war content, than the conventional narrative suggested. The archival record complicates simplistic claims made by both sides. For journalism education, the Vietnam War remains a central case study. Students learn about it as an example of courageous reporting, of speaking truth to power, of the importance of being willing to report uncomfortable facts even under pressure. But they also learn about its complexities, about the questions it raised about objectivity and advocacy that remain unresolved. The visual record of Vietnam has influenced how subsequent wars are portrayed, even by those with no direct memory of Vietnam coverage. The aesthetic of war journalism, the types of shots considered important, the narrative frames used to tell war stories were established during Vietnam and continue to shape coverage today. Cameramen and photographers covering conflicts in Syria or Ukraine are working in traditions established in the rice paddies and jungles of Vietnam. As the last helicopter lifted off from the American Embassy roof in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, it carried more than just evacuees. It carried the end of an era, the collapse of assumptions, the death of an American innocence that had somehow survived even 2 world wars. The Vietnam War changed America in countless ways. It divided the nation, traumatized a generation, reshaped politics, transformed culture. But perhaps no change was more profound or more lasting than the transformation in how Americans understood their government, their military, and their media. Before Vietnam, Americans generally trusted that their government told them the truth, that their military fought honorable wars for clear and just objectives, that their journalists would support national endeavors even while occasionally questioning tactics. After Vietnam, all of these assumptions lay in ruins. The media didn't destroy these assumptions. They didn't invent the credibility gap or create the opposition to the war. What the media did was make visible what the government wanted hidden, that the war wasn't being won, that the strategy wasn't working, that the justifications were flawed, that the costs were terrible and growing, that the mission wasn't as simple or as noble as official rhetoric claimed. In making this reality visible, journalism fulfilled its highest purpose in a democracy. It provided citizens with the information they needed to make informed judgments about the policies pursued in their name. It held power accountable. It refused to simply amplify official propaganda. These are not failures of journalism, they are its finest achievements. But these achievements came with costs that we're still paying. The adversarial relationship between press and government that emerged from Vietnam has sometimes devolved into reflexive opposition rather than principled skepticism. The loss of trust in institutions that began with Vietnam has metastasized into a broader crisis of authority, where Americans increasingly cannot agree on basic facts. The polarization of media that has its roots in Vietnam-era conflicts has fractured the shared information environment democracy requires. The question of whether media lost the Vietnam War is, ultimately, the wrong question. Media didn't lose the war. Failed strategy and impossible objectives lost the war. But media did make it impossible for that failure to be hidden or denied indefinitely. It did make the costs visible in ways that eroded political support. It did give voice and visibility to opposition that might otherwise have been marginalized. Whether these effects of coverage represented journalism doing its job or journalism undermining national security depends on how you answer a more fundamental question. In a democracy, should government be able to pursue policies that lose public support once the full reality of those policies becomes visible? Should media help government maintain support for policies by hiding uncomfortable realities? Or should media reveal those realities and trust citizens to make their own judgments? The journalists who covered Vietnam, the photographers who captured its iconic images, the network correspondents who brought it into American living rooms, generally believed that their obligation was to the truth rather than to policy. They saw their role as providing information, not as supporting national objectives. This conception of journalism's purpose, which seems obvious now, was genuinely controversial during Vietnam. For the Vietnamese people, both those who fought alongside Americans and those who opposed them, the American media coverage was both blessing and curse. It documented their suffering and sometimes gave voice to their perspectives, but it was also intensely focused on the American experience, treating Vietnam as the backdrop for an American drama, rather than a story about Vietnamese people determining their own future. As we look back more than 50 years after the peak of the war, we can see how profoundly it shaped not just journalism, but American society. The distrust of government authority, the questioning of military power, the expectation that institutions should be challenged rather than deferred to, the belief that images and information should be unrestricted even when uncomfortable. All these aspects of contemporary American culture have roots in the Vietnam era and the media coverage that documented it. We live in an age of information overload, of fragmented media, of polarized narratives, of deep fakes and misinformation. The challenges facing journalism today are vastly different from those faced by reporters in Saigon in 1968. But the fundamental questions remain the same. What obligations do journalists have in wartime? How do we balance national security with the public's right to know? When should images be shown, and when should they be withheld? How do we provide context without bias? How do we tell truth without propaganda? The Vietnam War and its coverage don't provide simple answers to these questions. What it provides is a case study in how journalism can matter, how coverage can shape not just opinion about a specific conflict, but the relationship between citizens and power in a democracy. It reminds us that images have power, that words matter, that truth-telling carries risks but is essential. In the end, the Vietnam War was the first televised war, the first war covered without censorship, the first war where journalists operated with unprecedented freedom and independence. It was also the last war covered that way, as subsequent conflicts have seen increasing military control over media access. Whether that represents lessons learned or lessons betrayed remains debated. But there's no debating that something fundamental changed during those years when Americans watched their war unfold on television screens, when photographs from Vietnam became cultural touchstones, when the gap between official rhetoric and reported reality grew too wide to ignore. Media didn't just document the Vietnam War, it changed how Americans thought about war, about power, about truth, and about themselves. The helicopters have long since departed the embassy roof. The war has passed into history and memory, but its media legacy remains, embedded in how we gather news, how we understand conflict, how we relate to authority, how we conceive of journalism's purpose. The Vietnam War changed the media, and the media changed America. We are still, in many ways, living with the consequences of those changes, still trying to understand what was gained and what was lost when war came into the living room and nothing was ever quite the same again.